Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to do a line by line analysis of the poem Ode to Autumn by John Keats. As I told you in the previous video, Ode to Autumn was composed after an evening walk near Winchester in 1819. It is also one of the last poems that Keats ever wrote, his money fast running out, as I told you, and he devoted himself to travel, and just over a year later, he died in Rome. Ode to Autumn is one of Keats's most sensual, image-laden poems. It is sumptuous. It is a sumptuous description of the season of autumn in a three-stanza structure, each of 11 lines and of an AB rhyme scheme. The first stanza deals primarily with the atmosphere of the poem of autumn, while the second addresses the autumn in the style of a female goddess with a trace of the homemaker about her, and the third stanza goes back to the beauty of autumn, advising her not to mourn the loss of springtime, for there is ample life in autumn. Let me read the stanza for you. First stanza. Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless, with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core, to swell the good and plump the hazel shells, with a sweet kernel to set budding more, and still more later flowers for the bees, until they think warm days will never cease, for summer has overbrimmed their clammy cells. Keats has always been considered as the poet of the senses, but in this, his final work, it is all the more clear why this attribute is so strongly tied to him. The first stanza is a celebration of autumn. Note the gorgeous, long voweled imagery that accompanies the writing, the reference to abundance, although autumn has been taken in much of British literature as the start of death, as a melancholy time, Keats has taken it here as a fruitful period of existence. There is a strong evidence of energy and beauty in the poem, with fruit, the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and the atmosphere that is created in the first stanza is ultimately one of peacefulness. That is not to say that there is not an undercurrent of misery running through the poem. Of course, there is. The idea, for example, of being full of ripeness to the core produces the parallel imagery of a climax. This is the ultimate glory of autumn, the last hurrah before the freezing grip of winter. The flow of sibilant sounds in the lines 9 to 11 create an easy, flowing rhythm. However, the reader does not get the sense that Keats is building up to something grand. Also, note the relieved tone of voice. Keats was never considered one of the highbrow poets, and in fact was criticized for his adherence to simple language. He believed quite honestly that poetry did not need to be complicated to be worth something. But the overall simplicity of Ode to Autumn is staggering. Even the imagery is clear cut, something that Keats has occasionally struggled with in his previous poems. Let me continue to read the poem. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor, thy hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies, while thy hook spares the next swath and all its twined flowers, and sometimes like a gleaner thou dost keep steady thy laden head across a brook, or by a cider press, with patient look thou watchest the last oozings hours by hours. The feeling of freedom in To Autumn goes on well into the second stanza. But here Keats leans in closer. He does not view autumn still from a wider perspective, but personifies the season itself, autumn itself, to make it perhaps easier for the reader to empathize with the season that he is so painstakingly bringing to life. In the second stanza, autumn is viewed as a fertile female goddess, however, like the fairy's child in La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. There remains a hint of cruelty to autumn. Keats, Keats's dichotomy of beautiful women with an edge of cruelty to them is hardly something staggering, as it is one of the ideas that is brought up quite strongly in his poetry. It could be because Keats himself was unlucky in love and so drew on his experiences to draft the women in his poems. Here, it is the word hook that provides much of the idea that Autumn is a cruel and kind woman. Although Hook is a harsh implement, a sound of war, the very next line is spares the next swath and all its twined flowers, implying a sense of fairness and kindness. The use of the phrase oozing also implies a certain level of cruelty. There is a sinister, drawn out sound to the word, which makes it seem far more threatening than the previous few lines. Let us go on to the last stanza, third stanza. Where are the songs of spring? Ay, where are they? Think not of them. Thou hast thy music too. While barred clouds bloom the soft dying day and touch the stubble plains with rosy hue, then in a wailful choir the small gnats moan among the river shallows borne aloft, or sinking as the light wind lives or dies, and full grown lambs loud breathe bleat from hilly bone, hedge crickets sing, and now with treble soft, the redbreast whistles from a garden croft, and gathering swallows twitter in the skies. In this last stanza, Keats addresses Autumn herself, physically implying that Autumn is mourning the loss of spring and considers herself at odds with her far more beautiful counterpart. Keats writes, think not of them, thou hast thy music too, explaining that autumn is just as beautiful as spring is, and perhaps even more so. He shows this by diving again into gorgeous imagery, describing the sun setting over the land, the stubbled land, and the insects that come out. Stubbled land means the land which is left with stubbles after harvest, and the insects that come out at night, the animals that were born in springtime and are now full grown, and the birds that one can find in autumn. However, as with all of Keats's poems, the melancholy shows up again in the last stanza, as Keats's use of words such as soft, dying, and rosy implies a bloody end, despite his best allusions to contrary. Throughout the poem, Keats alludes to the pastoral tradition in poetry, a form of poetic writing that celebrates the idea of the countryside and focuses primarily on the description of the surroundings. Although one of the simplest of Keats's poems and one of the most quiet in terms of plot, it remains one of his most lauded works. Although nothing much happens in it, it is, after all, following on the form of pastoral tradition. The beauty of Keats's language and skill of his mastery show that Keats's talent was just beginning at the time of his death. This much for today. Thank you.